My name's David Maccarone. I'm a solutions architect at AWS. And today we're going to play with Amplify, and we're going to see firsthand how it simplifies and accelerates the creation of serverless web apps. Now, this is a 300-level session. I only have a handful of slides. It is going to be hands-on keyboard, and you will be seeing code. So I hope that doesn't bother anyone. So we have a mission today, and hopefully it's a case of mission possible, not mission impossible. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to build a real-time web app to conduct instant polls. There is a napkin on the table to help you. As always, if you fail to deploy, the agency will disavow any knowledge of your actions. This recording will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck. Oh, it's dangerous. All right, let's get a look at that napkin. Let's see what we have to build today. So it looks like a polling booth app. There's a question at the top. For instance, what is your favorite AWS service? And below that, we have 4 candidates or options that a user can click or tap on to cast their vote, A, B, C, D. And below that, we've got live results. So a histogram that shows the number of votes per candidate. And most importantly, we have to have real-time updates. So this thing has to be updating in real time as hundreds or potentially thousands of users cast their votes. Now, you're probably thinking that there's no way we're going to be able to build this in the 26 minutes that we have left. But with Amplify on our side, I'm confident we can get this done. Let's accept this challenge. This is Werner Vogels, Amazon CTO, and this is him on stage a couple of years ago at re:Invent. And he posed this question: so what does the future look like? And as a developer, I can tell you that the future we're all striving for here at AWS is one where all the code that you ever write is business logic. So you've heard today in the keynote and other sessions about how the cloud fosters agility, how it encourages experimentation, even allows you to fail fast. And services and tools like Amplify are an enabler for operating in that mode. So let's see today if we can write the absolute minimum amount of generic plumbing code, and let's see if we can focus on the business logic, the things that are going to differentiate our app. So a bit of a deep dive. Amplify Framework, what does it give you? Well, the first thing is a rich set of libraries. So if you're developing JavaScript apps or mobile apps, perhaps you're using React or Vue.js or Angular, or maybe iOS and Android or React Native, Amplify has you covered. Amplify integrates with AWS services. So whether you're building APIs, authenticating users, writing data to a backend, perhaps even creating the database itself, again, Amplify has you covered. And the thing that brings all this together is the Amplify CLI, or command line interface. This is where we're going to be spending most of our time today. The Amplify CLI is really the heart of the Amplify experience, and it helps you configure your app and even write some of your code for you. Now, once we've built this app on my local machine, we're going to need to deploy it. We want to push it live to production. And to do that, we're going to use the AWS Amplify Console. So this is a CI, CD, and hosting service for serverless apps and their backends. And using it's a real snap. So you simply point it at your code in a Git repo. So this could be GitHub or Bitbucket, GitLab, doesn't really matter. You configure your build settings. And in many cases, Amplify is actually clever enough to infer those build settings for you by looking at your code. And then you point it at an environment and deploy. Now, that's effectively the end of my slides rather. We're going to code now. Okay, so what you're looking at here is AWS Cloud 9. This is a cloud-hosted IDE, or software development environment, and it's just accessed via a browser. So the first thing we're going to do, and just to restate our goal, we do need to build the app in the napkin. We're going to be using Vue.js today. So I'm going to issue a standard Vue create command, and we're going to call this application VoteRocket. And this is just going to spin up a boilerplate empty Vue.js app. Now, while that's running, I want to open this components file because I've got a bit of a laundry list of items that we're going to need to build today. So we need a front end, something that resembles what was on that napkin. And we're going to be talking to a backend, so we'll need an API for that. We're going to need to persist our data somewhere, so we'll use a database. There's going to be business logic tying all this together, and of course we can't forget that real-time UI requirement. That's going to be a challenge. So coming back here, our view create has executed, and I'll just CD into that just to show you that there is nothing fishy going on. It's just an empty Vue.js app. Now I should say I've installed the Amplify CLI already in this environment. So to get things started, to inject Amplify into my app, I'm going to run an Amplify init. And this is going to ask me a series of questions about my app. So enter a name for a project. Well, we'll go with VoteRocket. Enter a name for the environment. Let's call this one dev. And I'm building with JavaScript today, Vue.js. And which framework are we using, it's asking me? Well, it's already picked up that we're actually running Vue, so we'll go with that. And I'm just going to accept the defaults for the rest. Now, Amplify is going to create resources on my behalf, backend resources in AWS. So it's going to need credentials to do so. And in this case, it's asking me, do I want to use an AWS profile? And I do. And I'm just going to use the default one that I've got running on this machine. So that's initializing my project in the cloud. That's standing up some base Amplify infrastructure that we can build upon later on. And it's really just an S3 bucket for deployments and some IAM roles. Now, if you're familiar with this log output, this is a CloudFormation stack that it's building for me under the covers. So coming back to our list, we started with the front end. We've got that boilerplate Vue.js app. The next thing we're going to need to build is that API. Now that initial Amplify init has finished, and there's now a pro tip at the bottom, and it says, try Amplify add API to create a backend API. And strangely enough, that's exactly what we want to do. So I'm just going to paste that in. And the first question it's asking me is, do you want to have a GraphQL or a REST-based API? And of course we want GraphQL. And we'll call it VoteRocket. For authorization today, we'll keep things simple. We'll just use an API key. Do we have an annotated GraphQL schema? Well, we don't, but not to worry because Amplify is going to help us create that as well. So I'm going to say no. Do we want guided schema creation? Yes, please. Do you want to edit the schema now? Yes. So Amplify has created a file and it's asking us to edit that file. Let's just take a look. So this is a generic boilerplate GraphQL model. I'm going to replace that with something a little more relevant. So what we're modeling here is a candidate entity. This is something or someone that the user can vote for. And you can see there that a candidate has an ID, a name, a description, and of course the number of votes. I'm going to save this file, and we're going to see a little later how much Amplify is going to do for us based on just this 6-line schema. Back in my terminal, I'm going to press enter to continue. And the next thing it's saying is you should run an Amplify Push to build out all those backend resources in AWS. So let's do that. Now it's detected that we've added an API and it's wanting to modify our CloudFormation stack. So I'll just say yes, please go ahead and do that. Now it's asking me if I want to generate code for my API, some front-end code. I'm going to say yes to that because we'll be using it later on. And I'll just be accepting the defaults for everything else. Cool. So that's going ahead and it's standing up that API for me inside of AWS. And you can see the CloudFormation output here. Now, coming back to this list, we can see now that we have our API being spun up. It also said it was generating some front-end code for us, so that's good. I'm going to put another tick there. Now with the database, one thing I should mention that in this schema, we have an annotation here. And this is a model directive, and what this is saying is that this entity should be persisted to a DynamoDB backend. Keep that in mind because we'll come back to it. Okay, so that's still cooking. I'm just going to jump across to the console now. And let's take a look in AppSync. So AppSync is our managed service for hosting GraphQL APIs. And we can see that already there is a new API that's been created. It's my application name and the app environment joined together. So VoteRocket Dev. Let's open that. And let's jump across to schema. So this is interesting. We've got something that resembles the candidate model that I just provided. But what we can see is that Amplify has also gone ahead and built out a rich interface with all of the CRUD operations that we need for that model. So we've got create, read, update, delete, everything. This is 120 lines of schema code that I didn't have to write. And so we have things like queries, so I can get a candidate based on its ID. I can also list all the candidates and provide some filtering criteria. And it's also done a bunch of mutations for me. So a mutation in GraphQL is any operation that changes data. So think inserts, updates, deletes. And we've got mutation operations that have been created for us. So this is excellent. I'm going to be using these later on. Now if we come back to our CloudFormation, that's still being created. We're just going to wait for that to finish up. It shouldn't take long. Did everyone have a good lunch? That's a great question. If you don't mind, we'll take questions at the end. You can come and talk to me. We'll talk about that. Okay, so that's created. My API is now done, and it's generated a GraphQL endpoint, an API key, that my app can use to talk to that. Fantastic. Now let's jump back into the console, and let's execute a couple of queries against this just to see how things are working. So the first query I'm going to execute is this list candidates query, and this was one that Amplify created for me. And if I run that, we can see that it returns successfully, but of course there are no items in there because we haven't created anything yet. So let's go ahead and fix that. Now, the question that we're going to be posing to our users today is, what is your favorite serverless AWS service? And what I'm going to run now is a mutation, which has 4 of those create candidate operations. And so I'm creating an entry for Lambda, DynamoDB, API Gateway, and AppSync. Right? And each item has a name and a description. Let's execute that. Cool. So now that data has been persisted to the back end. And you're probably wondering, well, hold on, what back end? We haven't created a database yet. Well, Amplify went and did that for us. If I look here in data sources, there is an AppSync data source that's pointing to a DynamoDB table. And if we open that and take a look at the items in that table, here are the candidates that we just created, right? And I'll go ahead and open one of them. And each item has an ID, has my name, description, and the number of votes, which of course is 0 at this point because we haven't cast any votes yet. So you can see that I was able to provide a very small amount of information in that 5-line schema. And Amplify has gone ahead and created the GraphQL API in AppSync. It's created a DynamoDB backend, and it's wired everything together. And you're probably starting to see at this point that Amplify is a really opinionated framework. You give it a small amount of information, you answer some questions, it goes and applies some intelligent assumptions, and you get a really good default implementation. Now you can modify this implementation or refine it, but this is exactly what I need, so I'm going to leave it as is. Now one thing I also want to show, if we go back to the AppSync schema, is you'll notice this heading here, resolvers. A resolver in GraphQL is really, I guess, the glue that maps the contractual schema interface with the backend data sources. So for instance, when I run that create candidate mutation, what's actually happening on the back end? So for instance, if we look at the list candidates query that brings back all of my candidates and open the resolver, we can see that this is actually implemented as what we call a mapping template. And all this is doing is translating that list candidates operation into a DynamoDB query. This is Apache VTL, or Velocity Templating Language, for those that are interested. And again, you can customize this or modify it, but out of the gate, Amplify has given me what I need, so I'm just going to leave this for now. So coming back to our list, we've got our database and we've populated it with data, so that's good. The next thing we need to do is allow users to cast a vote. Now the way we're going to do that is by building a custom mutation. So we saw it had create, insert, update candidate. We want a new custom mutation that allows users to cast a vote. So I'm just going to jump across to my terminal and copy in some code I already have. But don't worry, I'll show you what's there. So the first thing I've done is update this, this schema code. So the 6 lines are what we had before, the first 6 lines, but we've added some extra stuff. Most notably, we have a new mutation called cast vote. And as input, it's going to take a candidate ID. So the user will call this mutation, they'll pass in the candidate ID they want to vote for, and behind the scenes we'll increment the number of votes. We also have this at AWS subscribe directive that you'll see below, and this is part of that real-time update requirement. So what this is going to allow is for clients, API clients, to tell AppSync, I am interested when a user casts a vote. Please notify me when that happens, and then I can take action, for instance, updating the UI. We'll come back to this as well. So we've got that defined, and we've also got this VTL template, and this is the business logic behind that operation. And what we're saying is, when a user casts a vote, I want to do a DynamoDB update. I want you to look up the candidate based on its ID, and I want you to run an update expression to atomically increment the number of votes by 1. Couldn't really be more simpler than that. Okay, so I've defined that cast vote operation, and I'm going to run an Amplify Push just to make sure that that is created on the back end. And again, it's going to update my CloudFormation stack to make that happen. And I'll just accept all the defaults. Now, while that's running, I'm going to multitask and open a second terminal window. And I'm going to copy in some, oh no, I'm not. Yeah, I'm going to copy in some front-end code. And again, don't worry, I will be showing you everything. So there are some small config files here and some style sheeting, but the bulk of the application is this view, this app.view file. And for anyone who's done Vue.js or JavaScript development, this should look reasonably familiar. So what we've got up the top is a template which defines the markup or the structure of my page. And here I have the actual question that I'm posing. And I'm generating a button for each candidate option. And below that, I'm rendering my chart. Now, the important stuff is really down here in the JavaScript. And one thing that you'll note is that I'm importing several files from this GraphQL folder. Now, I'm just going to open one of them because I haven't actually written these files. These have been auto-generated for me by Amplify. So what it's done is, when I said, yes, I wanted some client-side code, what it's gone and done is it's generated all of the client-side code that I need to call the API. So it's generated the API, the back end, and it's also built the client-side code that I need to execute those queries. So this is really trying to make my life super simple. If I open Mutations as well, it's the same thing. It's already done that boilerplate code for me. So this is great. I can focus on just my business logic. So just a few lines of note. When the app is created, the first thing it does is we're going to call a GraphQL operation. So we're going to call that backend. And this is part of the Amplify framework, this method. And the operation that we're going to call is this list candidates query that I just showed you 5 seconds ago. So I just have to run that single line of code to bring back the candidates from my backend DB. That's all I had to do. Similarly, when a user wants to cast a vote, we're going to call GraphQL again, but this time we'll be calling the cast vote mutation. And of course, we're passing in the candidate ID as a parameter. And below that, this is the code that actually hooks up that subscription. So what I'm saying here to AppSync is, I want to be notified every time that a user casts their vote, and I'm going to react to that by updating my UI when that happens. And that's essentially it. This is 65 lines of code. This is really not that much. And what you can see here is that Amplify and Vue are really doing the heavy lifting for me. I'm just focusing on some light-end UI business logic and making things look pretty. So we'll come back and we see that that Amplify Push has been completed. So just before we run the app, I'm going to install some front-end dependencies. Most notably, the AWS Amplify Framework, the bindings for Vue, and chart.js is the library that I'm going to use to render the chart. Okay, so let's run this thing. So demo gods be with us. Okay, something's running. It does take a bit of time to come up on the first run, so I'm just going to bring it up here. Cool. Okay, so there's our app. And we've got our 4 candidates. Let's vote for DynamoDB. So as I clicked on that, my vote's been cast and my UI is updating. Let's vote for a few other things. Awesome. So you can see that the counters are updating and the chart below is reflecting that. Okay, that's great. Let's open it up in a separate browser window because this is going to be the real test. Okay. So what I've got here is a separate browser, and let's cast votes in here. Okay, so you see as I cast my votes in one browser, it's reflecting in the other. And this is all happening via that AppSync subscription. All right, this is looking good. So our development's done. We're looking good. What we need to do now is deploy this thing into production. And the way we're going to do that is through the Amplify Console. So I'm just going to open that. So I've taken the code that we just wrote and I've put it in a GitHub repo. And this is how easy it is with Amplify Console. I select my Git provider. I've already authenticated into GitHub, so it should just pick up my repo, and it has. I will choose a branch, master. It's now asking me, do I want to use an existing environment or build a new one? I'm going to create a brand new environment. We'll call it prod. And it's asking for a service role because it needs permission to create these resources on my behalf. So I'll select one. And with the build settings, it says here, we've auto-detected your app's build settings. So this has already picked up that I'm using Vue. And it's actually looked at the code in my repo just then, and it has built out this build settings file for me. Now, I could update this if I wanted to, but this is precisely what I need. So I'm going to go ahead with that. And now I just need to check everything's looking good and run save and deploy. So what this is now going to do under the covers is build out a complete CI/CD pipeline and hosting for the serverless web app. So if we wait for a minute, we'll see that it's going to go through a series of steps. And this takes a few minutes to execute. So what I'm going to do is open one that I had prepared earlier. And so this was an app that when I made the last commit, you can see that it's automatically gone and done several steps. So it's provisioned a Docker container to do the build. It's cloned my repo, pulled that in. It's compiled my code, deployed it, the front end and the back end, and then it's done some verification checks to make sure everything's okay. And just to top it off, it's generated a screenshot just so I can see what my app looks like. So at each of these steps, I can click on the stage and look at the container output, so I can debug potential issues and see what's going on. And another thing it's done is I've got a custom domain here. So it has gone ahead and provisioned a TLS certificate for HTTPS. It's a free certificate, automatically rotated. And it has deployed the app into an S3 bucket. It's set up a CloudFront CDN distribution with a good set of caching behaviors, tied that certificate to my CloudFront. Okay. And it's also set up a binding redirect, so a redirect from my Apex domain to my www domain. So Amplify Console has done all this for me. I only had to click a couple of options to get it working. So that's really impressive. And I think now it's time to actually try this app. So if you get your phones out and head across to voterocket.net. I'll give you a second, or you can just type it in. And so it's voterocket.net. I'm going to do the same thing here. Let's go to voterocket.net. Okay, so someone likes Lambda. Okay, so you can see that, there we go, AppSync's catching up. So you can see this updating in real time, right? Not just on my laptop, but on your devices as well. And I think that's really impressive. Okay, well done, everyone. Okay, go easy. So our mission was possible. Now, I know what you're thinking. I did have some code pre-prepared, and my snippet game was strong, but think about the things that we didn't have to do today. So if you'd asked me a couple of years ago to take on this challenge, I probably would have been looking at something like Node or .NET to build a RESTful API. I'd have to create a database with a schema, wire that up, set up all the permissions, set up CI/CD, hosting, certificate rotation. And I didn't have to do any of that today, right? Amplify did that for me. So to recap, what we've got is a real-time single-page app built with Amplify Framework and Vue.js, and it's responsive, obviously. You saw it work on your phones as well. Talking to a serverless backend with AWS AppSync as our API engine and DynamoDB as the backing store. And we've got global hosting and continuous deployment using Amplify Console. And coming back to Werner's quote, think about the code that we did actually write. That cast vote resolver and our front-end UI logic to make things look nice and behave properly. That was it. Now, we've only just scratched the surface with Amplify. There is a ton that you can do, okay? So you can build RESTful APIs, not just GraphQL. You can authenticate users, full sign-in, sign-out registration experience. You can integrate with Lex for chatbots. We recently announced machine learning predictions, so you can do image object analysis and speech to text using recognition and transcribe. There's a lot of stuff out there, so please take a look. Here are some resources to get you going and to learn more. If you tap your badge or on the way out, scan your badge, you'll get notified when these materials or the slide deck are available. And that's all from me today, so thank you.